Last 4 or 5 that I started to integrate visual images in my lecture. And I can't imagine now teaching without, I can't imagine how I make people sit still for 50 minutes and listen to me blather on without having something to look at. Right? But I think those visual images are much more, they make the story much more compelling to people and memorable. And the other thing, I keep using this word story. You know, a lot of professional historians are a little uneasy about saying that what we do is tell stories, because that seems to suggest that we make it up. I mean, children tell stories, right? But in effect, that's what we do. We are offering interpretations, which means that we are assembling events in order to have, in a broader arc, in order to lead us to draw certain kinds of conclusions or to see things from a particular kind of way. And one of the great joys of teaching history that I think gives us an advantage over every other colleague we have, human beings love stories. And stories don't have to be simple. In fact, if you think about it, whether this is a story your family told you, or whether it's the Odyssey, or whether it's your favorite novel, some of the most profound insights we can get about other human beings come to us in the form of stories. So a lot of what I try to do is not only give visual images and tell stories, so they're analytical stories, but I also try to make sure that my lectures and my teaching in general is populated with people, because I think that also makes it easier. I can sit here and talk about, okay, here are 2 competing theories of how you organize around civil rights. But I can also show you 2 people who embody 2 different traditions, and you're much more likely to remember it. Anyway, what I'm going to start with today, and what we're going to do today, we'll talk a little bit later. These are just some readings that we thought would be very useful for you, and I'll run through them perhaps later. But if you recall, the last time you did speak to me, or I spoke to you, and it was not the previous, but 2 previous workshops ago, I tried to talk about the civil rights movement in a very broad terms, what I call the long civil rights movement. Not simply the civil rights movement that goes from Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 to Martin Luther King's assassination in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. And that reminds me, that was actually a question on your pretest. What was Martin Luther King doing in Memphis in 1968? Sanitation workers. And that's actually a really significant, illustrative data, right? One of the things that King said near the end of his life, as the movement had achieved a Civil Rights Act and a Voting Rights Act, and thus, at least on paper, formal equality for black people. It's hard to imagine, 5 years before, people had been risking their lives to try to sit at a lunch counter to get a cup of coffee. But having achieved that, there was a kind of growing recognition of the immense inequalities that existed. As King said, what's the use of being able to sit at a lunch counter if you don't have money to buy a hamburger? So where would the movement go after 1964, 1965? And it's very significant to think of Martin Luther King, what he was doing in that very last campaign of his life. In any event, what I tried to say was, look, we need to think more broadly. Black people didn't just simply wait passively around until the Supreme Court said that there would be desegregation. In fact, there had been a struggle by black people against the regime of Jim Crow, which had settled in after the end of Reconstruction. From its beginning, in some ways, I mean, one of my colleagues, Charlie Cobb, who you're going to actually hear a little bit about today, when Charlie teaches us as students, he said, look, this started, when did the Civil Rights Movement start? It started the first day a slave ship arrived. And there's a way in which it continues today, precisely because of the racial disparities that continue to exist in our society. And so I tried to set the Civil Rights Movement in a broader story about this period after the Second World War. I talked, for example, about the Cold War, and the ways in which the Cold War was a very important context for the Civil Rights Movement. Because part of what happened in the context of the Cold War is if you're in the middle of a battle for the hearts and minds of people in India and Asia, or Southeast Asia, and Africa, in a battle with the Soviet Union, it's really bad publicity for you in that battle when a person in India or Africa opens a newspaper and sees Will Connor's police dogs attacking children. So a lot of the impetus for civil rights actually came, or the fact that the federal government was belatedly, some ways reluctantly drawn in on the side of civil rights, had less to do with Kennedy or Johnson's, or particularly Kennedy's, concern for black people per se, than it had to do with fears of the way in which the reputation of the United States internationally was being bruised by this. Now, the Cold War, if you recall, I also spoke about, cut both ways, because it also created enormous suspicion against anyone who seemed to question the way things were in America. And the label communist, he's a communist, would be used particularly in Mississippi, where every civil rights worker was immediately labeled a communist by the authorities of the state. But the main thing I tried to do or to set up was, look, there's a lot about the civil rights movement that we think we know that maybe we don't. Because what I'm particularly interested in, this is my own research, is not simply understanding what happened 50 years ago in this state, but also understanding what the meaning of those events is and how it has changed over the course of 50 years. A lot of historians draw a distinction, and I sometimes do too, between history and memory. I'm less interested in a sense, what actually happened than in how we tell the story of what happened. And one of the things that I'm concerned about is that the main way most Americans know or tell the story about civil rights is about Martin Luther King. It's a great charismatic leader. We have a holiday for him every year. He had a dream. Now we all have a dream. And I worry that there's ways in which that particular story doesn't do justice to what happened. It certainly does not do justice to what happened in the state of Mississippi. Mississippi was a place that King did not spend a lot of time. Mississippi, the spearhead of the movement here, was not Martin Luther King. It was people, ordinary people, often people not much older than the students you teach. Often people, sharecroppers from the Mississippi Delta. People who had historically never been asked to speak for themselves, but who were spoken for by other political leaders, whether white or black, whether sympathetic or unsympathetic. The story of the Mississippi movement is a story of ordinary people claiming the right to speak for themselves. There's a biblical verse on this. You'll see it quoted in the letter from Bob Moses with the civil rights movement. The stone that the builders rejected, I have made the cornerstone. That's really the key that I want to get at in talking about the Mississippi movement. In doing this, I'm again going to try to decenter Martin Luther King. I'm going to try to decenter also the kind of movement that Martin Luther King led. Scholars working on the civil rights movement in Mississippi draw a distinction between mobilizing and organizing. I'm not sure you have to use those words, but let me try to explain to you what's at stake in that distinction. By mobilizing, they mean the kind of things that King was involved with in Selma or in the March on Washington, in which leaders, often charismatic leaders, people of great national reputation, in the media a lot, come into a town and rev people up for large-scale demonstrations in public space, often forcing a kind of confrontation with political authorities. And the power of that kind of politics would be vividly revealed in a place like Birmingham, where the movement of children offending segregationist laws was designed to and did indeed provoke an enormous white overreaction of fire hoses and police dogs. Those images, which are still engraved in our minds, were broadcast around the world, ultimately forcing a a somewhat timid federal government to begin to try to rally to the side of civil rights. That's not, however, how the Mississippi movement worked. One of the things that's very funny, I've taken TAH teachers from New England on Southern civil rights tours a lot. And when we take them to Alabama, which was King territory, it's easy. Because you go to Birmingham, there's a big museum, they can go to Kelly Ingram Park and they can see all these things. And you can go to Montgomery and you can see where the bus boycott was in this big museum. And you can go to Selma and you can see where they crossed Edmund Pettus Bridge. You can cross it, you can go to the big museums, right? This summer I took a group of New England teachers from Mississippi, through Mississippi. And they were like, where is all this? Where are these museums? Where are these sites? Where are the pictures? And partly that reflects the fact that this state has been somewhat slower than Alabama in trying to both honor, forgive me for saying it, commercialize its civil rights history. But it also reflects that the kind of work that was being done by Mississippi civil rights organizers was very different. This was knocking on doors in small towns, talking to people, asking them to come to a meeting that night in a church. They always called them mass meetings, though initially there might be only 3 or 4 people with the courage to show up. Asking those people, often at risk of their lives, to go down and try to register to vote. Slow, inconspicuous. And in fact, rather than trying to provoke a great conflagration with national media, a lot of that work was being done under the radar at considerable risk to the people who were doing it. So with that overlong introduction, let's get on and look at some pictures. So I thought I would first just show you pictures which will be familiar to you of the kind of familiar story of civil rights that we tell, right? So, Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. A year later in 1955, Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat, catapulting a young minister, Martin Luther King, into national prominence. And again, it was Ella Baker, who I'm going to talk about in a moment, who said, Martin didn't make the movement made Martin. And one of the themes that I was talking about last time, if you recall, was trying to show you the way in which there was a long tradition of political organizing in Montgomery. They ended up tapping King as leader, chiefly because he was new in town and wasn't yet either in anyone's pocket or hadn't been there to antagonize people. But that's the person who now becomes, for us, a synecdoche for, that's a $5 word for you, the one thing embodying the whole, a symbol of the entire movement. Of course, this is 1957 in Little Rock, where ultimately Dwight D. Eisenhower organized the 101st Airborne to come into Little Rock. So 9 people would attend Little Rock High School, Central High School. This was a crucial piece for thinking about Mississippi, the beginnings of a student. 4 students who were students at Greensboro A&T, in Greensboro, North Carolina, sitting at a local lunch counter. The sit-in movement spread all over the country. It came last to Mississippi because the risk of violence, which was everywhere, was so much more extreme here. The first sit-ins in Mississippi were, stand to be corrected in this, I think 1961 in Jackson. And there's a picture. And somebody said that they thought this was ketchup. This is actually blood. So it's Ann Moody, a student at Tougaloo College. Her book, Coming of Age in Mississippi, is one of the greatest biographies or autobiographies of black childhood in Mississippi I've ever read, describing her entrance into the civil rights movement. This is actually a white woman who was also a student at Tougaloo College named Joan Trumpauer, who had come down to Mississippi with the Freedom Rides, I'll get to that in a minute, and stayed. And this is a white professor at Tougaloo, John Salter. This is a powerful image. You can work with that image with your students. This particular event went on for something like 3 or 4 hours, while the police stood casually on the side, and while FBI agents stood on the street taking notes.